Welcome to the White Scar video. This video will be slightly different from my usual in that I'll show you how to paint this in real time. Now this miniature took me around 2 hours to completely paint, but that includes mixing between paints in the airbrush, just general faffing around, looking out the window, etc. This methodology will teach you how to paint very quick character miniatures to a very high standard, and it all starts with the backbone of a good pre-shade. On top of a black background, in this case this Scale 75 black primer, I had Medea Combat white. And you'll see in the notebook opposite exactly where I want to aim my most prominent highlights and shading. Once that's done, I cover the entire thing with a thin glaze of earth. This is a Vallejo colour, so you can still see the underlying black and white base coat. And then I take a makeup brush, add ivory to it, I'll knock off the majority of the paint, and I'll dry brush. Now this is a new technique I'm bringing into my work more and more. I'm mixing up airbrushing and brush stages in between one another. I keep comparing this to making all butter puff pastry, where you layer butter on top of flour, one over another, building up the layers. It's a similar kind of method. I watch way too much MasterChef. It's a similar methodology to how I approach this miniature. So we're overlapping airbrushing techniques to smooth everything down and to have a lot of transitions seamlessly blended one on top of another, and these very hard definitive lines given to us by a brush. The problem with airbrushing alone is that it gives you, well, it can look like a toy at the end of the process. All the colours are very nicely transitioned, smooth, but it lacks interest. The brush, on the other hand, it's harder to get those transitions. The airbrush makes it much easier, but the brush can give you definition, it could give you character, it could give you those incidental chips that make it look like a work actually produced by a hand. Now I will be using birch by Scale 75, and this is roughly thinned down with about 40% thinner. I'm using life color thinner, and I'll airbrush this across 2/3 of the total volume of the miniature. So this is if we could break the paint job into 5 portions, we have the shadow. Let me start that again. We have the shadow, the lower mid-tone, upper mid-tone, and highlight. This colour covers the lower mid-tone right the way through to the highlight. We only leave that shadow unpainted. It's a very thin colour, it's a very muted transition, but that's what you want at this stage. Several coats. Okay, next up I'm using Nakar by Scale 75 with a pinch of opaque white. I find just using the car, it hasn't really got the coverage I want. Even though the transitions are muted and gradual, sometimes I want to punch it up a little bit, and this is one of those instances. So by adding the opaque white in there, it just gives me more coverage and I'm able to see the transitions more clearly. Now I'm not worried about moving the Medea Combat in there because it's a very thinly formulated paint, high pigment, thin formulation, and I'll reinforce my upper mid-tones to highlight, where I've rather handily scratched it on the notebook opposite. Now if you want a traditional white scar that has a kind of dirty white appearance to it, do not follow the next stage. Stop here. We can move on to the oil stages after this stage. So Mike, if you're listening, you wanted a warm white tutorial, well this is it. You stop it at this point before moving on to the filter layer I'll be adding later. On top of the shadows, to reinforce them, I'll add coal black. This is an experiment that I've gone through with a student, Jonathan, thank you, where we want to represent the white scars as a ghostly apparition force. We wanted to give a more colour saturated, otherworldly, ethereal look to the white scars. Owing to their Legion history as being the outriders of the Crusade, they'll have many different detachments spread right the way throughout the galaxy, and they'll develop their own cultures. In this particular instance, this Keshig, this band of brothers, I believe that's the correct term, they were seen as ghost walkers. They walk between worlds. They had that ethereal edge to them. So that's what we wanted to bring out here. The coal black is a desaturated low value turquoise. I'll give a cool hint to the white armor. We are sandwiching the warm and cool tones one on top of another. So we have white, which is cool. Then we have the khaki tones in the earth, which is warm. Then we have this turquoise, which is a cool color. Again, it will generate more interest. And weirdly enough, when I posted this up online, a lot of people commented that it looked like Sons of Horus green. It looked like green. So I guess if you wanted a good Sons of Horus scheme, you could use this as well. Personally, I don't see it. I mean, there are green elements to it, sure, but it's not green. It's a white scar. It's white. And one of the reasons why we use coal black is that it does have a touch of green in there. So when we paint in the rest of the red metallic areas, the red plume, the green will play off against it way stronger. Okay, next up, I am using an incredibly thinned down coal black as a glaze consistency, and this will unite my shadows to the mid-tone. And it's very thinly pigmented. It's barely anything, a ghost tint. Next up, we use Nakar to bind everything together, and this will overlap the previous stage. Now you may be questioning, okay, why even put in the last stage if you're just going to overlap it here? Well, when we airbrush, we want those nice transitions, right? We want that nice seamless blend. One of the reasons why your airbrush might be sputtering, one of the reasons why you might not be generating those kind of nice glazing transitions is that, one, your paint might be too thick, and two, you just aren't using many transitions. You aren't using enough transitions. The Nakar is very thin down at this point, and there will be a slight bluish green inflection that you place over it. It may not be eye-popping, it may not really punch you in the head when you see it, but we are working in the realms of subtlety here. It rewards the patient viewer. We will lose some of this when we come to doing the oil glazing, or in this case the enamel glazing, but nice, subtle, refined. Watchwords for this tutorial. The white, I wanted to represent it, this ghostly, otherworldly hue. To finish this off, we are adding opaque white into the previous mixture, thin down again, glaze-like consistency. It's around 60% paint to 40% thinner. Now, why the change in consistency? Well, the opaque white is all very thin. You don't need to add that much thinner to it. The Nakar is very thin. You do not need to add as much thinner to that as you would a Games Workshop paint, for example. So even though I'm giving you the color recipes, I'm giving you the color consistencies, it's always better to rely on what you can see in front of you. If you believe the paint is too thin, thicken it up slightly with a pinch more paint. Give the paint a shake. If you're using color equivalent, you will need to come up with your own glaze consistencies. But on the whole, as a rough rule of thumb, it is always better to use it slightly thinner, frustratingly thin, and we can always thicken it up or add more layers as we go along. Okay, put your airbrush away, clean it out. We are going into the metallics. Now, I'll concentrate on the shoulder pad, where we're using a variety of copper tones from scale 75, and I'll be mixing them on the miniature itself. So to begin with, decayed metal, then pure copper, and in the transitional mark between there, I'll feather the two colours, and I'll also use old copper. Between these three colours, I can generate mid-tone, highlight, and shadow. Studying pictures like the one in the notebook will help you appreciate where to place your shadows and highlights. Essentially, you want to map out where your strongest highlight is in context with the airbrushing we've just done, and plot your shadows appropriately. So the nadir, the darkest point of the shadow, will often line up with the highest point of highlight on the shoulder pad itself. Have a look or refer back to the Sanguinius video, the preface to that, where we go through how lights and shadows develop on a metallic surface. I'd also advise that you read the Dawn NMM tutorial. It's a bit of a tongue twister there. But you can see I'm not using a layering technique, I'm using more of a traditional oil painting technique here, where I'm placing colours alongside one another and then relying on them being workable enough to use a brush and feather in between them. This is a very, very good example of what I was trying to explain in the last PDF done textures, where we looked at the Necromunda bounty hunter's face. It's one of those tutorials I appreciate is very frustrating to look at, because you just add a few colours and then the next frame, and then it's done and it's a fully painted face. It's a hard technique to take sequential pictures of and create a tutorial around. It's much easier to explain with this visual medium, where we can see the blends, where we can see where we place colours next to one another. Before they dry, gently feather them with the tip of the brush. We can generate a really nice transitional tone. Now this technique, if you want to try it with metallics. Metallics are slightly more forgiving in this regard, because the reflective nature of the metallic will mask any odd transitions that may come about. So if you wanted to try this technique out for the first time, now is the time to do it. Try on your metallics, especially your shoulder pads. One thing I was really keen to try out with this miniature is producing Damascus steel or Damascus steel edge. For this I used cobalt blue for the top half of the blade, for the flat portion, silver, then decayed metal. I'm using the same technique we've explored previously, where we're placing colours next to one another. Then I'm using cobalt blue to gently feather a pattern, a worn pattern into the edge of the blade to make it look like it's been used, it's been notched. So I'll flay out the tip of the bristles and I'll gently just mix them in one another. Just like that, you've got a Damascus steel blade within, 10 seconds? You could go on and reinforce this with further glazes. I do go on and further glaze this with the cobalt blue, decayed metal and silver. But it's the same technique, just again and again and again to deepen the overall impression. Deep red, hot orange and Huldra blue is now used for the plume. Again, we aren't using the layering technique where we apply one colour, wait for it to dry and then add subsequent lighter or darker colours. Instead, we are placing the colours next to one another, and before they dry we're feathering the two hues together. Because this is an organic shape, we don't need to be too careful in the intermixing between the two. There aren't very hard cuts between the two, so just keep it quite generalised. It will end up looking a bit like a fireball at the end of it. It's very, very striking, but we can add glazes over the top of this to neutralise it, to make it, well, not quite look like Hot Wheels. The band of leather across the blade is painted with black leather. This is slightly diluted, so the very top ridges are exposed and they are slightly lighter than where the paint flows into the gaps, into the detail of the leather itself. Now, you can paint the cloak in the same way that we painted the red plume, and the same of any red aspects you want to incorporate in the miniature. In this case I've painted the V in exactly the same technique and his symbol on his left shoulder pauldron. Okay, let's refine this a little bit. Hot orange is used at the very tip of the brush with a pinch of ivory. And instead of trying to paint every single hair, I just want to work in a band of light across it to give the impression that it has a sheen, that the top knot is catching the light and there's a reflective band of light across it. I'll push the highlight at this stage and I'll glaze it with red ink later on. But you can see I'm moving more of the deep red into the blue aspects. It's neutralizing it, it's making it look a lot more natural. To finish off the blade, I use sandalwood with the very tip of my brush. I'll highlight as carefully as I possibly can the very top ridges of the leather. That's it. Let's use enamel paint, shall we? If you've watched any of my other tutorials, more than likely you would have come across a oil painting segment where we take oil paints, we use thinners and create the consistency we're aiming for, whether it be a pin wash, like in this example, or stain. This stuff is an enamel. Enamels differ from oils in the fact that they are cut with a different material, their thinning base is different. In this case, enamel rather than oil. You don't need any special thinners. Enamel thinner is preferred, but I find using the low odor thinner that I use for my oil paints work exactly the same way here. In this case, I'm just trying to add a pin wash into the darkest recesses of the sculpt. When we airbrush miniatures, it can lead to very boring overall appearances and you lose a lot of the detail of the sculpt. By applying the pin wash, we re-establish the sculpt and give artificial shadow. In this case, I'm not using pure black, I'm using blue-grey wash by Humbrol. And this will help redefine the aspects of the miniature that I want. The face grill, the shoulder pads, the bits in between his knuckles. I'm using blue-grey here to further reinforce the blue-green hue I have in the shadows. once you've managed to hit all the gaps and recesses, we need to juice those metallics. In this case I'm using Agrax Earthshade, and I'll follow it up with a tiny amount of red ink mixed with the Agrax Earthshade over the copper bronze. Then I'll use pure copper to re-highlight the portions of copper that I painted, and then I'll mix a small amount of silver to further highlight that on the very peak edge highlights of the shoulder pads and any of the copper areas that we've painted. So hopefully the green of the white will start to play off against the reds that we're starting to build up in the tones. The copper shoulder pads will look slightly more in keeping with the aesthetic of the Heresy rather than using a plain matte red. One of the classic problems with White Scars is that it's quite a cartoony colour scheme. The red, the yellow, the red, the gold and the white. It can give the impression of it looking like a toy. By breaking up the reds with this copper metallic, well, we just give it another element. We slightly skew it away from that unrealistic look. You can see in the example opposite in the artwork that the red isn't wholly just a matte colour, it's a very highly reflective metallic red. It's almost like a brown colour. It's not a rich saturated red like you'd find in the Blood Angel, for example. Okay, to finish off the white armour, we are using Nakar. Again, Nakar, I'm really not sure how to pronounce that. If anybody does speak Spanish, could you correct me? I feel like it should be pronounced Nasar, I don't know. It's a beautiful colour, but I always feel like an idiot saying it. So I'm using this to reinforce the highlight, especially on the helm, and I'll build up on top of this by mixing in a small amount of Marrow White for those very top peak edge highlights. Now I'll concentrate these highlights especially on the helm, but I'll also hit the top of the arms, the knuckles, top of the backpack, indeed any area that would naturally come into the most contact with the sunlight. Consistency of the paint needs to be thicker than semi-skim milk, but nowhere near as thick as straight out of the bottle. It's kind of hard to describe exactly how thin you need this stuff to be, because semi-skim milk, it doesn't really cover it. Maybe clotted cream might be a better example, slightly thinned down clotted cream. I'm worried if I use these examples, these tutorials are going to sound like a cooking show rather than a painting show. Okay, Eclipse Grey is now used with a stippling brush. So this is an old Winsor & Newton brush that I've cut into several pieces. Now this paint is as thick as it can be. Take it straight from the pot, add it to the bristles, and then knock off the majority of it. Essentially, we need a very little amount of paint on the brush itself. We need it to be dry brush consistency. We should really struggle to impart any kind of paint, of pigment, onto the miniature itself. And that's it. That is the White Scar tutorial. I really hope you enjoyed this. You can base it however you want. In my particular instance, I used black leather, so it has that reddish look to it, again playing off against the top plume and playing off against the slight green hint in the armour. Really hope you enjoyed this, especially for the long-standing White Scar fans out there. Mike, let me know what you think. If you do experiment with this, please let me know, or post up what your experiments have yielded. I hope you have fun painting your miniatures and painting whatever white that you choose to in this scheme. If you do use this on your White Scars, please send me photographs, please send me correspondences. I want to see what this creates, what this spurs on in your own creativity. Thank you so much, guys. Next up we have the conclusion of the Mastodon tutorial, and then Raldoron at the end of the month. Thank you very much. I'll catch you soon. Bye.